Cold autumn rain lashed against the chapel windows, but the storm inside was far more violent. To the congregation, she was a vision of obedience, a bride fulfilling her duty. But beneath the ivory lace, her heart was suffocating under the weight of a future she could not bear. She wasn't kneeling for love. She was kneeling for survival. One vow meant safety. One word of consent meant a lifetime of silence. But the soul has a way of refusing chains. When she walked away, the organ stopped, and a father's rage changed her destiny forever. Welcome back, my beautiful family. Before we begin, please click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The winter of 1887 was not remembered for its snow, but for the scandal that sent tremors through the drawing rooms of the county elite. The season had begun with the usual parade of engagements and ambitious mothers, shepherding their daughters toward advantageous matches. But that morning, at St. Catherine's Chapel, where the Honorable Viscount Valery had arranged a marriage calculated to save his dwindling fortune, the air felt thick with something sharper than incense. And Valery stood at the altar, her gloved hands gripping a bouquet of white roses so tightly the thorns pierced through the silk, drawing blood she couldn't feel. The organ was playing a processional, a solemn, dutiful melody that stood in violent contrast to the wild, desperate rebellion roaring in her chest. Every breath was an act of defiance against her own fate. Say the words. Accept your place. A voice hissed in her mind, her father's voice, the same one that had delivered the ultimatum 3 nights prior in his study. Lord Edmund Hartwell waited at the altar. He was a man of 47 with cold eyes and a smile that calculated dowries before it calculated affection. He was wealthy, titled, and utterly devoid of warmth. To the world, he was a catch. To Anne, he was a tomb with a title. Dearly beloved, the vicar began, his voice echoing off the stone walls, we are gathered here today. Anne looked up. Through her veil, she saw Edmund's face, the eager triumph in his expression, the way his gaze traveled over her as if she were an acquisition already finalized. She saw her future in that look, years of silent dinners, of children raised by nurses, of her voice diminishing until it disappeared entirely. The chapel suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air turning to water in her lungs. I cannot. The realization arrived not as a thought, but as a physical truth, as undeniable as the blood now staining her gloves. If any person here present. And dropped the bouquet. The roses scattered across the marble floor, white petals against gray stone, like surrender flags she refused to raise. I cannot do this, she said, her voice cutting through the sacred silence. The vicar stopped mid-sentence. Edmund's smile froze, then cracked. Gasps rippled through the pews like wind through wheat. Anne, her father's voice was a whip from the front row, sharp with warning and barely contained fury. But Anne had already turned. She gathered her skirts in both hands, feeling the weight of every eye upon her, hearing the whispers beginning to hiss like steam from a kettle. She walked down the aisle, not running, not fleeing, but walking with deliberate, measured steps toward the chapel doors. Behind her, chaos erupted. Her mother's wail. Edmund's outraged shout. Her father's heavy footsteps pursuing her. But Anne didn't stop. She pushed through the doors and into the rain, letting the downpour soak through her veil, her gown, washing away the pretense, the performance, the lie. She had just destroyed her reputation. Shattered her family's plans. Condemned herself to social exile. And for the first time in months, she could breathe. 3 days later, Anne stood in her father's study, no longer dressed in bridal white but in a simple grey dress that matched her new status, a daughter in disgrace. The Viscount sat behind his mahogany desk, his face carved from granite and disappointment. "You have left me no choice," he said, his voice cold and final. "No man of standing will have you now. You are unmarriageable. Unmanageable. A stain upon this family's name." And lifted her chin, refusing to bow beneath his judgment. "Then I will make my own way." Her father's laugh was bitter and sharp. "With what? You have no dowry now. No prospects. No references." He leaned forward, and she saw something cruel flicker in his eyes, a punishment carefully designed. "But there is one place that will take you. One man desperate enough to accept even a ruined woman as a companion." And felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn cold seeping through the windows. "Ferdinand Dean," her father continued, "the Duke of Sedgwick. You've heard the whispers, I'm sure. The broken Duke. The cripple of the North. He had a riding accident. Hasn't walked in 3 years. Hasn't been seen in public. He's dismissed every attendant, driven away every companion with his temper and his despair." The Viscount pulled a document from his desk drawer, a letter bearing an official seal. "His mother, the Duchess, is searching for someone to manage him. Someone who won't flee at the first sign of his moods. Someone who has nowhere else to go." He slid the paper across the desk. "You will go to the Duke's estate in Northumberland. You will serve as his companion, though you will receive no title, no recognition, and certainly no gratitude. You will be a shadow in his household, tolerated but not celebrated." And stared at the letter, feeling the walls of her world closing in once more, but this time from a different direction. "And if I refuse?" Her father's smile was devoid of warmth. "Then you will be cast out with nothing. No money. No name. No protection." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. The streets of London are not kind to women alone, Anne. Even stubborn ones. It was a choice between one cage and another. Between the known cruelty of her father's house and the unknown darkness of a broken duke's estate. And reached for the letter, her hand steady despite the trembling in her chest. "When do I leave?" The journey north was long and bleak. The landscape shifted from the manicured gardens of the home counties to the wild, windswept moors of Northumberland, where the sky seemed to press down upon the earth and the sea roared its discontent against jagged cliffs. The Duke's estate, Sedgwick Hall, loomed on a promontory overlooking the North Sea, a great stone fortress that had weathered centuries of storms and now sheltered a man who had been defeated by one terrible moment. And arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was failing and the wind carried the salt tang of the ocean. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, but no one emerged to greet her. Eventually, a footman appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Valerie," he said with a stiff bow, "Her Grace is expecting you." And followed him through halls that spoke of faded grandeur, portraits of stern ancestors, suits of armor gathering dust, windows that looked out only onto grey sky and greyer sea. The house felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a place where life had retreated and left only its echo. The Duchess received her in a drawing-room that faced the cliffs. She was a woman of severe beauty, her silver hair pulled back tightly, her dark eyes assessing and with the precision of a jeweler examining a questionable stone. "You are younger than I expected," the Duchess said without preamble, "and more colorful." And glanced down at her traveling dress, a deep sapphire blue she had chosen deliberately that morning, refusing to arrive as a shadow before she had even begun. "I did not think mourning colors were required, Your Grace." The Duchess's lips twitched, something that might have been approval or might have been warning. You will find that this house operates under certain rules. My son does not tolerate pity. He does not accept help. He has made it abundantly clear that he wishes to be left alone with his chair and his view of the sea. She paused, and her voice softened, just slightly. Every woman we have sent to him has lasted less than a week. They arrive with gentle smiles and soft voices, thinking they can coax him back to life with kindness. And that doesn't work. Anne asked. He destroys them with silence and cruelty until they flee. The Duchess met Anne's gaze directly. I am told you refused a marriage to save yourself from a cage. Perhaps you will understand that my son has built his own cage, and he will not thank you for trying to dismantle it. Anne felt something stir in her chest, not pity, but recognition. A man who had been told he was broken. A woman who had been told she was ruined. Perhaps they were both simply refusing to accept the definitions others had given them. Where is he? Anne asked. The Duchess gestured toward the east wing. He keeps to the rooms that face the sea. He has arranged his furniture to make it difficult for visitors to approach. He will not speak to you. He may not even look at you. She stood, her posture rigid with years of aristocratic training. But you are welcome to try, Miss Valerie. After all, you have nowhere else to go. It was the truth, spoken without malice but with absolute clarity. Anne curtsied and turned toward the east wing, her heart beating steady and strong despite the uncertainty ahead. She had walked away from one fate. Now she was walking toward another. And this time, she would not be walking alone. Anne's first sight of Ferdinand Dean came 3 hours after her arrival, and it was not a meeting so much as an ambush. The Duchess had left her in the care of a stern housekeeper named Mrs. Daventry, who showed her to a room in the west wing, far from the Duke's quarters. The chamber was adequate but cold, with a single window that looked out onto the courtyard rather than the sea. Anne understood the message immediately. She was not a guest, and she would not be granted the privilege of the view that Ferdinand had claimed for himself. She unpacked her single trunk, hanging the few dresses she had been permitted to take from her father's house. Most were practical grays and browns, but she had hidden the sapphire traveling dress at the bottom, along with one gown of deep emerald that she had worn to a garden party the previous summer, before everything had fallen apart. She ran her fingers over the emerald silk, feeling its richness, its defiance. She would wear it when the moment required courage. Mrs. Daventry returned at 6 o'clock to inform her that dinner would be taken in her room. His Grace does not dine with companions, the housekeeper said, her tone suggesting that Anne should not take this personally, as His Grace did not dine with anyone. Anne ate alone, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that was well prepared but served without ceremony. Afterwards, she stood at her window, watching the last light drain from the sky, and made a decision. She would not wait to be summoned. She would not arrive as a supplicant, hoping to be granted an audience. If Ferdinand Dean wanted to hide in his rooms, he could do so, but he would have to look at her first. Anne changed into the emerald gown, fastening the buttons herself, arranging her auburn hair so that it caught the lamplight. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like a woman preparing for battle, and perhaps she was. The east wing was reached by a long corridor that seemed to grow darker with each step, as if light itself had learned to avoid this part of the house. The servants had already retired, and Anne's footsteps echoed against the stone floors. She passed closed doors and draped furniture, evidence of a household that had contracted around its wounded master. At the end of the corridor, a set of double doors stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, Anne could see firelight flickering against walls lined with books. She heard nothing, no movement, no voice, only the crackle of burning wood and the distant roar of the sea beyond the windows. And pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was vast, a library or study that had been converted into living quarters. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, filled with volumes that looked both well-read and recently abandoned. A fire burned in a massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across the floor. And there, positioned before the windows that looked out onto the black expanse of the North Sea, sat Ferdinand Dean. He was in a wheelchair, his back to the door, his attention fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. Even from behind, and could see the breadth of his shoulders, the proud set of his head, the way he held himself as if the chair were a throne rather than a prison. His hair was dark, touched with premature silver at the temples, and his hands gripped the arms of the chair with a tension that spoke of barely contained fury. He did not turn when she entered. He did not acknowledge her presence at all. And took another step forward, and the floorboard creaked beneath her weight. "Get out." His voice was low, rough from disuse, but it carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had once commanded soldiers in battle. It was not a request. It was a command issued by someone who expected immediate obedience. And did not move. "I said, get out." This time, there was an edge to the words, a warning that most people would have heeded. And walked closer instead, moving around the perimeter of the room so that she could see his profile. His face was striking, almost brutal in its angles, a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken and healed slightly crooked, eyes that were the color of storm clouds. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 32 or 33, and the waste of it, the tragedy of such vitality confined to a chair, would have moved her to pity if she had been anyone else. But Anne had been raised by a man who mistook pity for weakness, and she had learned that the cruelest thing you could offer someone was sympathy they had not requested. "No," she said simply. Ferdinand's head snapped toward her, and for the first time, he looked at her fully. His eyes widened fractionally when he saw the emerald dress, the way it caught the firelight, the way she stood before him not as a shadow or a servant, but as a woman who had chosen to be visible. "I don't know who sent you," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "but I have made it abundantly clear that I do not want company. I do not need company. And I certainly do not require the services of some." He paused, searching for the word that would wound most effectively, "some ruined girl dressed in silk she can no longer afford, playing at being useful." The insult landed with precision, designed to send her fleeing back to her cold room in the West Wing. And felt the sting of it, the accuracy of his assessment. He had already heard her story, already judged her as thoroughly as her father had. But she had not walked away from one man's cruelty only to crumble before another's. "You're quite right," Anne said, her voice steady. "I am ruined. I am here because I have nowhere else to go. And this dress is the last nice thing I own." She took another step closer. "But I am not here to be useful to you, Your Grace. I am here because your mother believes you need someone who won't run away at the first sign of your temper. And I am here because we have both been told we are broken. So perhaps we can endure each other's company without pretending either of us wants it." Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling fire. Ferdinand stared at her, and saw something flicker behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition, or the faintest spark of something that might have been respect. Then his expression hardened again, and he turned back to the window. "Fine," he said. "Stay if you must. But do not expect conversation. Do not expect gratitude. And do not," his voice dropped to something almost dangerous, "do not ever presume to understand what I need." And nodded, though he could not see it. She walked to a chair positioned near the fire, one that had clearly been placed to discourage visitors from staying, and she sat down, arranging her emerald skirts carefully. "I brought a book," she said, pulling a small volume from the pocket sewn into her dress. "I'll be here if you change your mind about conversation. Otherwise, I'll simply read." She opened the book, found her place, and began to read silently. The Duke said nothing. The fire crackled. The sea roared beyond the windows. And for the first time in 3 years, Ferdinand Dean was not alone in his chosen exile, whether he wanted the company or not. 3 days passed in a stalemate of silence. And arrived each evening at precisely 7 o'clock, wearing a different dress each time, each one a deliberate statement of color against the gloom of Ferdinand's quarters. The sapphire. A burgundy that caught the firelight like wine. A silver gray that shimmered when she moved. She would enter without knocking, settle into the chair she had claimed as her own, and read by the light of the fire while Ferdinand maintained his vigil at the window. He never spoke to her. Never looked at her directly. But noticed the small changes. The way his shoulders tensed when she entered, as if bracing for an invasion. The way his fingers would still their restless drumming on the chair's arms when she turned a page. The way, on the second night, he had moved one of the side tables slightly closer to her chair, though he would never admit to such a concession. On the 4th evening, and decided to alter the routine. She arrived at 7 o'clock as usual, but instead of carrying a book, she brought a tray. On it sat 2 cups of tea, a plate of shortbread biscuits that she had charmed from the cook, and a small vase containing a single stem of heather she had plucked from the cliffs that morning. Ferdinand heard her footsteps, heard the gentle clink of porcelain, and finally turned his head. "What," he said, his voice laden with suspicion, "is that?" "Tea," and replied, setting the tray on the table between them. "And biscuits. Mrs. Pritchard makes them with brown sugar. They're quite good. I didn't ask for tea. I'm aware." And poured 2 cups with practiced ease, adding a splash of milk to one before offering it to him. "But I thought perhaps we could have a conversation that doesn't consist entirely of you telling me to leave and me refusing." Ferdinand stared at the offered cup as if it were a weapon. "I have no interest in conversation." "Then don't speak," and said, placing the cup on the small table beside his chair, close enough to reach but not forced upon him. "But I've been sitting in silence for 3 days, and I'm beginning to forget the sound of my own voice. So I'm going to talk, and you can ignore me if you prefer." She settled into her chair, cradling her own cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. The fire crackled between them, and beyond the windows, the sea churned beneath a darkening sky. "I've been exploring the grounds," and began, as if he had asked. "The cliffs are magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. There's a path that leads down to a small cove, though I imagine it's impassable at high tide." She sipped her tea. "The Duchess told me you used to ride along those cliffs every morning. That you knew every path, every stone." Ferdinand's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "She also told me," and continued, her voice gentler now, "that the accident happened there. That your horse startled, and you fell." "Stop." The word was quiet but absolute. And looked at him directly, unflinching. "I'm not going to pity you for it. I said stop. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." And set down her cup. "But I am going to tell you that I walked that path this morning, and I thought about how terrifying it must have been. And how much courage it must have taken to survive it." Ferdinand's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You know nothing about courage. You're a girl who ran away from a wedding because she was too proud to accept her duty. You're right, and said simply. I was too proud. Too proud to spend my life as a decoration in a man's house, producing heirs and pretending I was grateful for the privilege. She leaned forward, and her voice carried a steel edge now. And you're too proud to let anyone see you as anything less than the perfect soldier you used to be. So perhaps we're both insufferably proud. But at least I'm not hiding in the dark pretending I'm already dead. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was charged, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. Ferdinand turned his chair with a sharp, violent movement, wheeling himself away from the window and directly toward her. He stopped close enough that Anne could see the fury in his eyes, the pain beneath it, the terrible vulnerability he kept locked behind walls of anger. You want to know why I stay in this room? His voice was low, shaking with barely controlled rage. Because out there, I am an object of pity. The broken duke. The man who fell. Every person who looks at me sees what I've lost, what I can no longer do. They see a tragedy, not a man. And in here? And met his gaze without flinching. In here you see the same thing. You've made yourself into exactly what you're afraid they'll see. Ferdinand's breath came harsh and fast, as if she had struck him physically. For a moment, Anne thought he might shout, might order her out with such force that even she would have to obey. Instead, he laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound, but it was genuine. My mother was right about you, he said finally. You are absolutely insufferable. Yes, Anne agreed. I am. Your tea is getting cold. Ferdinand looked at the cup sitting beside his chair, then back at Anne with an expression she couldn't quite read. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for it and took a sip. It's terrible, he said. Far too much milk. Then perhaps tomorrow you'll tell me how you prefer it, Anne replied, picking up her own cup again. There won't be a tomorrow. You'll be gone by morning, like all the others. No, Anne said quietly, I won't. They sat in silence then, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the hostile emptiness of the past 3 days, but something else. A truce, perhaps. Or the beginning of one. Ferdinand drank his tea despite complaining about it. And ate 2 biscuits and left the rest on the plate between them. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. When Anne finally stood to leave, smoothing down her burgundy skirts, Ferdinand spoke again. The heather, he said, nodding toward the small vase. It doesn't grow on the cliffs in autumn. And paused at the door, a small smile playing at her lips. No, she admitted. I found it in the conservatory. But I thought it might remind you what's beyond these windows when you're not looking at them. She left before he could respond, closing the door softly behind her. Ferdinand sat alone in the firelight, staring at the purple heather, and for the first time in 3 years, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong about wanting to be left alone. But he would never tell her that. Not yet. The routine continued for another week, each evening bringing small victories. Ferdinand began to speak, not freely, but in measured sentences that suggested he was testing the weight of conversation after years of silence. He corrected her pronunciation of a Welsh place name. He recommended a book from his shelf when he noticed her finishing the one she had brought. He even laughed once, a real laugh, when she described the housekeeper's horror at finding her climbing the library ladder in her good dress. But Anne noticed something else as well. She noticed the way Ferdinand's hands would sometimes tremble when he reached for his cup. The way his face would tighten with pain he tried to hide when he adjusted his position in the chair. The way, on particularly damp days, he would press his fingers against his temples as if trying to hold back a tide of agony. She said nothing about these observations, understanding that to acknowledge his pain would be to violate the unspoken terms of their truce. But she watched, and she worried in silence. On the 10th evening, Anne arrived to find the door to Ferdinand's quarters closed and locked. She knocked, received no answer, and knocked again with more force. "Go away." His voice came through the wood, rough and strained. "No," Anne said simply, trying the handle again. "Open the door, Ferdinand." "I said go away. I don't want company tonight." Anne pressed her palm against the door, frustration and concern warring within her. "Then tell me through the door that you're well, and I'll leave." Silence. "Ferdinand. I'm well. Leave." But his voice betrayed him. It was thin with pain, and Anne heard something beneath it that made her chest tighten with alarm. She turned and nearly ran down the corridor, finding Mrs. Daventry in the servants' hall. "I need the key to the Duke's quarters. Now." The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Miss Valerie, His Grace has made it clear." "I don't care what he's made clear. He's hurt. Get me the key or I'll break down the door myself." Something in Anne's expression must have convinced her, because Mrs. Daventry produced a ring of keys from her belt and handed them over with shaking hands. "If he dismisses you for this, then I'll be dismissed." Anne was already moving back down the corridor. "Send for Dr. Morris. Tell him to come immediately." She unlocked the door and pushed it open to find the room in darkness except for the dying fire. Ferdinand was in his chair near the window, but his position was wrong, slumped to one side, one hand gripping the armrest while the other pressed against his ribs. "I told you to leave," he said through gritted teeth, but the words lacked conviction. And crossed to him quickly, kneeling beside the chair. In the firelight, she could see the pallor of his skin, the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his breathing came too shallow and too fast. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the fear coursing through her. "Nothing. A muscle spasm. It happens." He tried to straighten, and a sound escaped him that he clearly hadn't meant to release, something between a gasp and a cry. And stood and moved to light the lamps, flooding the room with brightness he usually avoided. When she returned to his side, she saw what the shadows had hidden. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and blood seeped through the fabric. "Ferdinand," she said quietly, "you're bleeding." "It's nothing. Stop lying to me." And reached for his shoulder, and he flinched away. "Let me see it." "No." The word was absolute, but Anne heard the fear beneath it, the shame. "I'm not asking." She began to unbutton his shirt with steady hands, ignoring his protests, ignoring the way he tried to push her away with weakening resistance. When she pulled the fabric back from his shoulder, she understood. The scarring was extensive, a landscape of healed wounds that told the story of the fall in brutal detail. But worse than the old injuries was the fresh damage. The skin had torn where it had healed poorly, reopening along lines that should have been properly tended years ago. And felt something crack open in her chest, not pity, but fury. Fury at whoever had treated these wounds so carelessly that they continued to cause him pain. Fury at the isolation that had allowed this to fester. Fury at a world that had looked at a wounded man and decided he was easier to forget than to heal. "How long has this been happening?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It doesn't matter." "How long, Ferdinand?" He looked away from her, toward the windows, toward the darkness beyond. "Since the accident. The wounds healed, but not properly. When I move certain ways, when the weather changes, they reopen." It's manageable. Manageable, and repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. She took his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. You're bleeding through your shirt, you can barely breathe from the pain, and you locked yourself in here rather than ask for help. That is not manageable. That is torture. What would you have me do? Ferdinand's voice broke on the question. Call in physicians who will poke and prod and look at me as if I'm a specimen. Who will shake their heads and tell me there's nothing to be done except manage the pain. I've heard it all before, Anne. I'm broken. I know I'm broken. I don't need anyone else to confirm it. Anne held his gaze, and in that moment, she understood something fundamental about Ferdinand Dean. He didn't fear the pain. He feared the confirmation that he was beyond repair, that he would live out his days as a collection of poorly healed wounds and shattered dignity. You're not broken, she said fiercely. You're hurt. There's a difference. And I don't care how many physicians told you nothing could be done. We're going to find someone who will actually fix this properly. Anne. No. Listen to me. Her hands were still framing his face, and she felt the tremor in his jaw, the way he was fighting to maintain control. You gave me a fortress when I had nowhere else to go. You let me sit in your silence without demanding I be anyone other than who I am. So now I'm going to give you something in return. Not pity. Not gentle sympathy. But someone who will fight to make sure you get the help you actually need. Ferdinand's eyes searched hers, looking for the lie, the condescension, the hidden agenda. But and let him look, let him see the truth of her determination. Why? He asked finally, the word barely a whisper. Because you're my friend, Anne said simply. And because neither of us deserves to be abandoned to our pain simply because it's inconvenient for others. A knock came at the door, and Dr. Morris entered, black bag in hand, his expression carefully professional. He took in the scene, and kneeling beside the Duke's chair, Ferdinand's torn and bloodied shirt, and his eyes widened with understanding. Your Grace, he said, approaching slowly. Miss Valerie tells me you're in need of assistance. Ferdinand looked at Anne one more time, and she saw the moment he chose to trust her. It was a small surrender, but it meant everything. Yes, he said quietly. I am. And stood and stepped back, giving the physician room to work. But she didn't leave. She stayed by the fire, watching, bearing witness, making sure Ferdinand knew he wasn't facing this alone. And for the first time since his fall, Ferdinand let himself be helped, because someone had finally offered help without making him feel smaller for needing it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a private courier who refused to wait for a reply. And was in the conservatory, sketching the winter roses that somehow still bloomed despite the northern cold, when Mrs. Daventry found her with the envelope on a silver tray. The seal was her father's, the crimson wax stamped with the Valerie crest, and Anne felt her stomach drop even before she broke it open. The message was brief and devastating in its precision. Anne. Lord Edmund Hartwell has petitioned for breach of contract. The magistrate has ruled in his favor. You are to return to London immediately to fulfill your obligations as his betrothed, or face legal consequences that will extend to any who harbor you. Your defiance has cost this family enough. Do not compound your selfishness by dragging others into your disgrace. Viscount Valerie. And read it twice, her hands trembling, before she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She sat very still among the roses, feeling the walls closing in once more, feeling the freedom she had fought so hard to claim slipping through her fingers like water. She had been foolish to think she could simply walk away. Men like Edmund Hartwell did not accept refusal. They pursued what they believed they owned until they reclaimed it or destroyed it. And was still sitting there an hour later when Ferdinand found her. He wheeled himself into the conservatory with the confidence of someone who had finally stopped treating his chair as an enemy. Dr. Morris's treatments over the past 3 weeks had made a remarkable difference. The wounds had been properly cleaned and stitched, a regimen of exercises had been prescribed, and Ferdinand had begun to sleep without the constant interruption of pain. He looked better. Stronger. More like the man he must have been before the fall. But when he saw Anne's face, all that confidence faltered. "What happened?" he asked, crossing to her immediately. And tried to smile, tried to arrange her expression into something that wouldn't betray the terror coursing through her veins. "Nothing. I was just thinking. Don't lie to me." Ferdinand's tone was gentle but firm. "Not after everything." "No," he said flatly, crushing the letter in his fist. "Absolutely not. I don't have a choice." Anne's voice was steady despite the fear. "Edmund has the law on his side. My father arranged the betrothal contract properly. If I don't return, he can have me arrested for breach. And if your mother harbors me, they can bring charges against the estate. Then let them try." Ferdinand's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Let them come here and attempt to remove you. I'd like to see them succeed." "Ferdinand, you can't." "I can't what?" "Protect someone under my roof. Someone who has become." He stopped, seeming to realize what he was about to say, then continued more carefully, "Someone I consider a friend?" And felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. "I won't let you risk everything for me. You've already given me more than I had any right to expect. I'll go back to London. I'll find a way to manage Edmund. By marrying him. If I must." Ferdinand stared at her for a long moment, and saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made, calculations being weighed and measured. "There is another option," he said slowly. "What option?" Ferdinand took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had commanded troops in battle. "Marry me instead." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible and somehow perfectly logical all at once. Anne laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "Ferdinand, don't be ridiculous." "I'm not being ridiculous. I'm being strategic." He wheeled closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Hartwell's claim is based on a betrothal contract, but that contract becomes void if you're already married. And a marriage to a duke supersedes any agreement with a mere lord. You can't marry me just to save me from Edmund." "Why not?" Ferdinand's expression was fierce, determined. "You saved me from bleeding to death in the dark. You made me remember what it feels like to be a man rather than a collection of injuries. Why shouldn't I return the favor?" "Because marriage is permanent," Anne said desperately. "Because you deserve someone who..." "Someone who what?" "Someone who isn't ruined. Someone who didn't flee her own wedding." Ferdinand reached for her hand, and his grip was warm and steady. "Anne, listen to me. I know this isn't a love match. I know it's not what either of us imagined for ourselves. But it could be a partnership. An alliance between two people who understand what it means to be discarded by the world." And looked down at their joined hands, feeling the truth of his words settling into her bones. It would be a marriage of convenience, yes. A strategic arrangement to protect them both from the cruelties of a society that had labeled them as damaged goods. But it would also be honest. Built on mutual respect rather than romantic illusions. Founded on the friendship they had forged in the firelight of his study. What would your mother say? Anne asked quietly. My mother would say I've finally done something sensible. A hint of a smile touched Ferdinand's lips. She's been trying to marry me off for years. She'll be delighted I chose someone who doesn't bore me to tears. And society? The scandal? Let them talk. They already call me the broken duke. Let them add, married to a runaway bride, to the list. He squeezed her hand. Anne, I'm offering you a fortress. A name that even your father's contracts can't breach. And in return, you give me something infinitely more valuable. What's that? A reason to keep living forward instead of hiding in the past. Anne felt the tears finally spill over, but they weren't tears of despair anymore. They were something else, something that tasted like relief and gratitude and the faint, fragile beginning of hope. Are you certain? She asked, needing to hear him say it one more time. I've never been more certain of anything. Ferdinand's voice was steady, absolute. Marry me, and Valerie. Not because you have to, but because it's the one choice that's actually yours to make. And looked at him, this man who had been broken and rebuilt, who had shown her that strength wasn't the absence of wounds but the courage to keep standing despite them. She thought about Edmund's cold eyes, about her father's ultimatum, about all the cages she had been offered in the guise of security. And then she thought about the evenings by the fire, the conversations that had slowly transformed into friendship, the way Ferdinand looked at her as if she were a person rather than a problem to be solved. Yes, she said, the word falling from her lips like a key turning in a lock. Yes, I'll marry you. Ferdinand exhaled, a sound of relief and something deeper, and then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Then we'll send word to London tomorrow, he said. And by the time your father and Edmund arrive to collect you, you'll be the Duchess of Sedgwick, and there won't be a damn thing they can do about it. Anne laughed through her tears, and Ferdinand pulled her closer, letting her rest her forehead against his shoulder while the winter roses bloomed around them and the world outside prepared to judge a marriage it would never understand. But understanding didn't matter. Survival did. And together, they had just claimed their right to it. They were married 3 days later in the small chapel on the estate grounds, with only the Duchess, Dr. Morris, and a handful of servants as witnesses. There was no time for elaborate preparations, no announcements sent to London society, no flower arrangements or musicians. Just a simple ceremony performed by the local vicar who had known Ferdinand since childhood and asked no questions about the haste. And wore the emerald dress, the one she had worn the first night she refused to leave his study. It seemed fitting somehow, a reminder of where they had begun, of the battle of wills that had somehow transformed into this unlikely alliance. Ferdinand wore his military dress uniform, the dark blue coat with gold braiding that he hadn't touched in 3 years. Mrs. Daventry had aired it out, pressed it carefully, and when he emerged from his quarters that morning, and had seen the ghost of the man he used to be, the commander who had led soldiers through impossible odds. The ceremony was brief. Anne spoke her vows clearly, without trembling, and when Ferdinand repeated his, she heard the same steady certainty that had made her believe his proposal in the first place. They were not promising eternal love or romantic devotion. They were promising something more practical and somehow more profound, to stand together against a world that had tried to break them both. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Ferdinand took Anne's hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of respect rather than passion, and she understood that this was the language they would speak together. Not the language of grand gestures and flowery declarations, but the language of quiet solidarity. The wedding breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, the one that faced the gardens rather than the sea. The Duchess presided over the table with an expression that might have been satisfaction or relief or perhaps both. She raised her glass in a toast, her words simple and direct. To survival, she said, and to the stubbornness that makes it possible. They drank to that, and caught Ferdinand's eye across the table, seeing the hint of amusement there, the acknowledgement that they had both survived things that should have destroyed them. After the meal, Ferdinand asked Anne to join him in his study. Their study now, she supposed, though the thought still felt strange and new. She followed him down the familiar corridor, past the doors she had learned to navigate in the dark, until they reached the room where everything had begun. He wheeled himself to the desk and opened a drawer, removing a small velvet box that looked old, the fabric worn at the edges. He held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the line of the box's closure, before he turned to face her. "I should have given you this before the ceremony," he said. "But I wanted to wait until we were alone. Until I could explain what it means." And moved closer, curious despite herself. "What is it?" Ferdinand opened the box, revealing a ring nestled in silk. It was gold, set with a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The design was old-fashioned but elegant, clearly an heirloom that had passed through generations. "It was my grandmother's," Ferdinand said quietly. "She married my grandfather in 1825, and by all accounts, theirs was also a practical arrangement. Two estates joining, two families creating an alliance." He lifted the ring from the box, holding it carefully. "But my grandmother used to tell me that practicality doesn't preclude partnership. That respect is a more solid foundation than passion, because passion fades, but respect, if properly tended, can grow into something stronger." And felt something tighten in her chest, a recognition of what he was offering her. Not romance, but something more valuable. "She wore this ring for 60 years, Ferdinand continued. "Through wars, through losses, through times when I'm certain she and my grandfather must have wanted to strangle each other. But they endured. They built something that lasted." He looked up at Anne, and his expression was serious, almost solemn. "I'm not offering you love, Anne. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore, if I ever was. But I can offer you what my grandmother valued above all else, respect, safety, and loyalty. No matter what comes, no matter what scandals or whispers follow us, you will have my protection and my partnership." And extended her hand, letting him slide the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "And what do I offer you in return?" she asked softly. Ferdinand smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You've already given it to me. You saw me at my worst, at my most broken and bitter, and you refused to let me disappear into the darkness. You fought for me when I had stopped fighting for myself." He closed his hand gently around hers. "You gave me a reason to remember I'm still a man, not just a collection of injuries and regrets." And looked down at the ring, at the sapphire that seemed to hold an ocean of blue within its depths, and felt the weight of what they were building together. Not a fairy tale, not a grand romance, but something more honest. A partnership forged in mutual understanding, in shared pain, in the recognition that survival sometimes means choosing to stand with someone rather than standing alone. "I will honor this," she said, meeting his eyes. "Not because I have to, but because you've earned it. You've given me a fortress when I needed one, and I will be your fortress in return." "Then we have an accord," Ferdinand said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he believed it, truly believed that this strange marriage might actually work. They sat together in the study as the afternoon light faded, not speaking, not needing to. The ring on Anne's finger caught the firelight, throwing small prisms of color across the walls, and she thought about Ferdinand's grandmother, about 60 years of partnership built on respect rather than illusion. It was more than most marriages offered. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. And as Ferdinand reached for the book he had been reading, settling into the comfortable silence they had created between them, and realized that she had found something rare, a man who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength rather than trying to diminish it, who understood that the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't pretty words or grand gestures, but simply this, the unwavering promise to stand beside them, come what may. She touched the ring, feeling its weight, its history, its promise. And she smiled, because for the first time in her life, she felt like she had chosen her own future rather than having it chosen for her. That, she thought, was worth more than all the romantic declarations in the world. The letter from the Duchess arrived on their fourth day as husband and wife, delivered over breakfast in the morning room that and was slowly learning to think of as theirs rather than his. Ferdinand read it while and spread marmalade on her toast, and she watched his expression shift from neutral to grim to something that looked almost like amusement. My mother has invited us to attend services at St. Mary's this Sunday, he said, setting the letter down beside his coffee cup. She suggests, rather strongly, that it would be wise to make a public appearance before the rumors solidify into something we can't control. And paused mid-bite. The village church. The same one where half the county gentry worship every week. Ferdinand's tone was dry. She's arranged for us to sit in the family pew. First row. Impossible to miss. She wants us to parade our scandal in front of everyone. She wants us to show them we're not ashamed. Ferdinand met Anne's eyes across the table. That we're not hiding. That we have nothing to apologize for. And set down her toast, her appetite suddenly gone. She had known this moment would come, the moment when they would have to step out of the fortress of Sedgwick Hall and face the world that had labeled them both as damaged goods. But knowing it and facing it were two different things entirely. What if I'm not ready? She asked quietly. Ferdinand reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Then we wait. The world can think what it likes. We don't owe them anything. And looked at his hand on hers, at the ring on her finger that caught the morning light, and felt something shift inside her. They had made vows to each other, yes, but they had also made an unspoken promise, to stop letting other people's judgments dictate their choices. No, she said, straightening her shoulders. Your mother is right. If we hide, we give them permission to define us. But if we show them we don't care about their whispers, we take that power away. Ferdinand smiled, and there was pride in it. Then we'll go. But I warn you, it won't be pleasant. Lord Edmund will almost certainly be there. Your father may attend as well. And the gossips will be circling like vultures. Let them circle, and said with more confidence than she felt. I've faced worse than wagging tongues. Sunday arrived cold and grey, the sky threatening snow that hadn't yet fallen. And dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep plum silk that the Duchess had ordered made for her, along with a matching pelisse lined with fur. She pinned her hair in an elegant chignon and added the sapphire earrings that had belonged to Ferdinand's grandmother, a loan from the Duchess that felt like acceptance. When she descended the stairs, she found Ferdinand waiting in the entrance hall, and her breath caught in her throat. He was standing. Not in his wheelchair, but on his own 2 feet, leaning heavily on a pair of walking sticks that Dr. Morris had commissioned, but standing nonetheless. The effort showed in the tension of his jaw, in the way his knuckles whitened on the handles, but he was upright, and the sight of him sent a surge of emotion through Anne's chest. Ferdinand, she breathed, moving toward him quickly. You don't have to. Yes, he said firmly, I do. If we're going to face them, I'm going to face them as a man, not as an invalid they can dismiss. He took a careful step forward, and then saw the pain it cost him, but also the determination. Besides, I want to walk into that church with my wife on my arm. I want them to see that I chose you, that you chose me, and that neither of us is broken enough to be ashamed. And felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Instead, she stepped to his side, carefully offering her arm in a way that provided support without making it obvious. Then let's give them something to talk about. The carriage ride to the village was tense and silent, both of them preparing for battle in their own ways. When they arrived at St. Mary's, the churchyard was already full of carriages and parishioners making their way inside. And saw heads turn, saw the moment recognition rippled through the crowd, saw lips moving in whispered conversations. Ferdinand descended from the carriage first, refusing the footman's help, and then turned to assist and down. The simple gesture became a statement, and then heard the gasps, the sharp intakes of breath from those who had expected to see the broken Duke confined to his chair. They walked toward the church entrance together, Ferdinand's progress slow but steady, and matching his pace without hurry or apology. The crowd parted before them like water around stone, and then felt the weight of every stare, every judgment, every whispered word. She saw Edmund Hartwell standing near the entrance, his face mottled with rage, and she met his gaze without flinching. She saw her father beside him, the Viscount's expression carved from ice and disappointment, and she lifted her chin higher. They passed through the church doors and into the nave, where the congregation had already begun to settle into pews. The family pew was indeed in the first row, positioned prominently before the altar, and every eye in the church watched as Ferdinand and Anne made their slow, deliberate way down the aisle. And heard the whispers rising around them like a tide. The runaway bride and the crippled Duke. Married in secret, can you imagine? She must be desperate, and he must be mad. Poor man, trapped with damaged goods. Ferdinand's hand tightened on his walking stick, and then felt him begin to turn, ready to face down the cruelty with words that would slice like blades. But Anne stopped him with a gentle pressure on his arm. Instead, she turned to face the congregation herself, letting them see the sapphire ring on her finger, the matching earrings at her ears, the duchess's coronet she wore in her hair. "Good morning," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the sudden silence. "How lovely to see so many of you here to celebrate with us. Ferdinand and I are quite pleased you could attend our first public appearance as husband and wife." She smiled then, a smile that was all edges and challenge, and she saw several of the gossips flush and look away, caught in the act of their cruelty. Ferdinand let out a low sound that might have been a laugh, and he continued forward to their pew, settling carefully into his seat with Anne beside him. The Duchess was already there, and she reached over to squeeze Anne's hand briefly, an acknowledgement of approval. The service began, but Anne barely heard the vicar's words. She was too aware of the stares boring into the back of her head, too conscious of Edmund's rage radiating from somewhere behind them, too focused on the solid warmth of Ferdinand beside her, his presence a reminder that she was no longer alone in facing the world's judgment. When the service ended and they rose to leave, Ferdinand took her arm again, and they walked back down the aisle together, facing the congregation with neither shame nor apology. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them judge. Anne and Ferdinand had made their choice, and they would stand by it together, come what may. As they stepped out into the cold morning air, the first snowflakes began to fall, and Anne felt something like hope settle in her chest. They had survived the first battle. And they would survive whatever came next. Together. The fog rolled in from the sea 3 nights after their church appearance, thick and grey and smelling of salt and secrets. And stood at the window of their bedroom, watching the mist swallow the cliffs, feeling an inexplicable unease settle in her chest like a premonition. Behind her, Ferdinand was reading in bed, his walking sticks propped against the nightstand. They had established a comfortable routine in the week since the wedding, separate rooms initially, then a gradual migration towards sharing space, though intimacy remained a threshold neither had yet crossed. It was enough to sleep in the same room, to know someone else breathed in the darkness, to wake without the crushing weight of solitude. "You're troubled," Ferdinand observed, setting down his book. "I can see it in the way you're standing." And turned from the window. "It's nothing. Just a feeling. Your feelings have proven reliable before." He swung his legs carefully out of bed, reaching for his walking sticks. "Tell me." Before Anne could answer, a knock came at the door, urgent and sharp. Mrs. Daventry's voice followed, strained with tension. "Your Grace, there's a man at the gate. He's demanding to speak with Her Grace. He says it's urgent and involves her family." Anne and Ferdinand exchanged a glance, and she saw her own wariness reflected in his eyes. It was past 10 o'clock, far too late for social calls, and the phrasing, involving her family, carried an implicit threat. "I'll handle this," Ferdinand said, moving toward the door. "No." And caught his arm. "If it's about my family, I should be there. We face things together, remember." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Together." They descended the stairs to find the household in a state of quiet alarm. The Duchess stood in the entrance hall, her dressing gown hastily covered by a shawl, her expression severe. 2 footmen flanked the door, and through the glass panels, and could see a figure standing in the courtyard, shrouded in fog. "He won't give his name," the Duchess said as they approached. "But he claims to have information about Anne's mother that cannot wait until morning." Anne felt ice slide through her veins. Her mother had died when Anne was 12, a quiet passing from illness that had left her father bitter and her childhood effectively over. What information could possibly exist that would bring a stranger to their door at night? "Let him in," Anne said quietly. "But keep the footmen present." The door opened, and the man stepped into the light. He was middle-aged, perhaps 50, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years in climates harsher than England. His clothes were well made but worn, his boots muddy from traveling, and his eyes held a calculating intelligence that made Anne immediately cautious. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Ferdinand before turning to Anne. "And Your Grace. Forgive the late hour, but my business could not wait." "State your business," Ferdinand said coldly, "and your name." "My name is Thomas Garrett. I was, many years ago, the private secretary to the late Viscountess Valerie." His gaze fixed on Anne. "Your mother, madam." And felt her breath catch. "My mother never mentioned a secretary named Garrett." "No, she wouldn't have. I left your father's service rather suddenly, you see, when I discovered something that the Viscount preferred to keep hidden." Garrett reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, aged and water-stained. "But before I left, I took certain documents with me. Insurance, you might say." "Get to the point," Ferdinand said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command. "What do you want?" Garrett smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I want what I'm owed. You see, the late Viscountess had a fortune of her own, inherited from her father. A substantial estate in Cornwall, investments in shipping, properties in London. All of it was meant to pass to her daughter upon her marriage." And shook her head. "That's impossible. My father told me my mother died with nothing. That we were living on his income alone." "Your father lied." Garrett opened the portfolio, revealing yellowed papers covered in careful script. "These are the original deeds and investment documents. Your mother entrusted them to me shortly before her death, fearing that your father would somehow misappropriate the funds. She wanted to ensure you received your inheritance. Ferdinand moved closer to examine the documents, his expression darkening as he read. These appear genuine. If they are, Anne's inheritance would be considerable. Enough to make her independently wealthy. Precisely. Garrett's smile widened. But there's a complication. You see, your father has been drawing on these funds for years, forging documents, creating false sales, funneling the money into his own accounts. If these papers were to be made public, if the right magistrate were to investigate, the Viscount would face charges of fraud and theft. And understood then, the shape of the trap closing around them. You want money to keep quiet. I prefer to think of it as compensation for my years of discretion. Garrett named a sum that made even the Duchess inhale sharply. A modest amount, really, considering what's at stake. Your father's reputation, his freedom, the family name. Surely that's worth protecting. Ferdinand's hand tightened on his walking stick, and then saw the fury building in him, the soldier's instinct to eliminate threats decisively. But she placed a hand on his arm, staying him. My father destroyed my reputation, and said quietly. He tried to sell me to a man I despised. He cast me out when I refused to obey. Why would I pay to protect him from the consequences of his own crimes? Garrett's smile faltered slightly. Because, Your Grace, if this scandal breaks, it will touch you as well. The daughter of a fraudster and thief. Your marriage will be questioned, your position in society undermined. And your husband's family, the Duchess's good name, will be dragged through the courts. It was a clever threat, aimed not at Anne's love for her father, which didn't exist, but at her desire to protect the family that had finally given her sanctuary. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the sea beyond the fog. Anne felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her, the familiar sensation of being trapped between impossible options. But then Ferdinand spoke, his voice calm and absolutely certain. Mr. Garrett, you've made a fundamental miscalculation. You assumed we would fear scandal. But my wife and I have already survived the worst society could throw at us. We married in defiance of every expectation, and we've claimed our right to exist without shame. He moved forward, and despite the walking sticks, there was something intimidating in his presence. So here's what will happen instead. You will leave those documents with us. We will present them to our solicitor in the morning. And we will pursue full legal action against the Viscount, reclaiming every penny he stole from my wife's inheritance. And if I refuse? Garrett's confidence was cracking now, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. Then I will have you arrested for attempted extortion and blackmail. Ferdinand's smile was cold. I'm a duke, Mr. Garrett. I have connections in every court in England. You, on the other hand, are a disgraced secretary attempting to profit from stolen documents. Who do you think the magistrate will believe? Anne felt something warm bloom in her chest, a fierce pride in this man who stood beside her, who refused to let anyone threaten what they had built together. Garrett looked between them, seeing his scheme crumbling, and finally placed the portfolio on the side table with hands that trembled slightly. You're making a mistake, he said weakly. The scandal will finally force my father to face justice, and finished. And I will not sacrifice my integrity to protect a man who never protected me. Garrett was escorted from the house by the footmen, his threats dissolving into the fog that had brought him. When the door closed behind him, Anne felt her knees weaken, the adrenaline draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. Ferdinand caught her, steadying her, and she leaned into his solid warmth. Thank you, she whispered. Always, he replied, and in that single word, and heard the promise renewed, they would face every threat together, every storm, every attempt to break them apart. The fog would lift with morning. And when it did, they would begin the fight to reclaim what had been stolen from her. But tonight, they had won simply by refusing to be afraid. And that, Anne thought, was victory enough. The morning after Garrett's visit, Anne woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. The fog had lifted from the sea, and with it, something had lifted from her as well. She had spent her entire life being acted upon, by her father's decisions, by Edmund's demands, by society's expectations. But now, for the first time, she had the means and the power to act for herself. She found Ferdinand already in the study, the documents from Garrett spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. He looked up when she entered, concern flickering across his face. "You should be resting," he said. Last night was illuminating." And crossed to the desk, examining the papers with fresh eyes. "These documents prove my mother left me a fortune. They prove my father has been stealing from me for years. But they're not enough on their own, are they?" Ferdinand leaned back in his chair, studying her. "No. Garrett's papers show what your mother intended, but to prove your father actually committed fraud, we'd need to trace the money. Show the forgeries, the false transactions, the pattern of theft." He paused. "It would require access to your father's personal records, his bank accounts, his correspondence. Then we need to get them." Anne's voice was steady, determined. "Anne, breaking into your father's study would be—" "I'm not suggesting breaking in." A plan was forming in her mind, built on years of observation, of watching her father's habits, of understanding how he thought. "My father keeps meticulous records. He's paranoid about being audited, so he documents everything. If he's been forging documents and moving money, there will be evidence in his study, which we can't access without his permission or a court order, neither of which he'll provide." And smiled, and there was something sharp in it. "But I can. I'm still his daughter. If I write to him, express remorse for my hasty marriage, suggest that perhaps I've been too harsh in my judgment." She met Ferdinand's gaze. "He'll receive me. His pride won't allow him to turn me away in front of witnesses. And once I'm in the house, I can get what we need." Ferdinand stood, leaning heavily on his walking sticks, his expression troubled. "You're talking about walking back into a place that nearly destroyed you. About facing a man who tried to sell you like property." "I am." And moved closer to him. "But this time, I'm not going as his powerless daughter. I'm going as the Duchess of Sedgwick, with resources and protection he can't touch. And I'm going to take back everything he stole from me." She saw the moment Ferdinand understood, the moment he recognized the strength it took to choose this confrontation rather than simply letting solicitors handle it from a distance. "You're certain?" he asked quietly. "I've never been more certain of anything." And placed her hand over his. "He took my choices from me. He took my inheritance. He took years of my life and gave me nothing but duty and obligation. I want to look him in the eye when he realizes he's lost. Not as his victim, but as someone who fought back and won." Ferdinand studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we do this together. I'll accompany you to London. I'll be in that house with you." "He won't like that." "I don't care what he likes." Ferdinand's voice carried the steel of command. "You're my wife. Where you go, I go. And if he tries to hurt you in any way, he'll learn exactly what a broken duke can still do when properly motivated." They traveled to London 3 days later, bringing with them not only Garrett's documents but also a solicitor named Mr. Pemberton who specialized in cases of financial fraud. The Duchess had recommended him, and his reputation for tenacity was legendary among the aristocracy. Anne's letter had been perfectly crafted, a masterpiece of implied contrition and daughterly concern. She had written of her desire to reconcile, to explain her actions, to seek his understanding now that she had time to reflect on her choices. It was exactly what her father's ego needed to hear, and as predicted, his response came within 2 days, a cold but gracious invitation to call upon him at the family townhouse. Anne dressed carefully for the visit, choosing a gown of deep gray silk that suggested somber reflection rather than celebratory defiance. She wore the sapphire ring Ferdinand had given her, but otherwise kept her jewelry modest. She needed to appear as the repentant daughter, at least long enough to gain access to what she needed. Ferdinand wore his military coat again, and though he still required his walking sticks, he carried himself with such authority that no one would dare call him diminished. They arrived at the Valerie townhouse in Mayfair just after noon. The butler who opened the door was the same man who had served the family for 20 years, and then saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw her, followed quickly by carefully cultivated neutrality. "Miss N," he said, then corrected himself hastily, "I beg your pardon." "Your Grace." "Hello, Carlson." And managed a small smile. "Is my father receiving?" "He is in his study. He's been expecting you." They were led through the familiar halls, past furniture and had known since childhood, past portraits of ancestors who had watched her grow up in this house that had never quite felt like home. She felt Ferdinand's presence beside her like an anchor, steady and unshakable. The study door opened, and there sat the Viscount, positioned behind his massive mahogany desk like a judge ready to pass sentence. He looked older then and remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, his hair grayer. But his eyes held the same cold assessment they always had. "Anne." He didn't rise. "And the Duke of Sedgwick." "How unexpected." "My husband insisted on accompanying me." And kept her voice respectful but firm. "I hope you don't mind." "Of course not." The Viscount's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Please, sit. Tell me what has prompted this sudden desire for reconciliation." And sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she had been lectured countless times, where she had been informed of her engagement to Edmund, where she had last seen her father before fleeing the chapel. But this time, she didn't feel small. She felt the weight of the ring on her finger, the solid presence of Ferdinand slightly behind her, the knowledge that she finally had power of her own. "I wanted to understand," she began, letting her voice carry a tremor of uncertainty. "To understand why you were so determined that I marry Lord Hartwell. I've been thinking, perhaps there were financial concerns I didn't appreciate." The Viscount's expression shifted, and then saw the opening. He wanted to justify himself, to explain his actions as prudent rather than cruel. "You were always too idealistic," he said, warming to his subject. "Too concerned with sentiment rather than practical necessity. The family's financial position requires, careful management. Your mother's death left complications that a child couldn't understand." "Complications?" And leaned forward, playing the role of the interested daughter. "What kind of complications?" And there it was, the first crack in his armor. Her father began to speak, to explain, to justify, and as he did, he revealed more than he intended about assets and accounts, about her mother's estate and how it had been, necessarily absorbed, into the family holdings. Ferdinand remained silent throughout, but Anne felt his attention sharpening, cataloguing every admission, every detail that would later be used to build their case. after 30 minutes, and excused herself, claiming she needed to visit the powder room. The Viscount barely noticed, too engaged in his own narrative of financial martyrdom, and climbed the stairs to the second floor, but instead of turning toward the powder room, she moved quickly toward the room she knew her father used for his private correspondence, a smaller study off his bedroom where he kept his personal ledgers and most sensitive documents. The door was locked, but Anne had anticipated this. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small key, one she had kept from her girlhood when she used to help her father file papers, before he decided daughters were better seen than involved. The key still worked. Inside, she found exactly what she needed: ledgers showing transfers from accounts bearing her mother's maiden name, correspondence with banks, forged signatures on sale documents. Her father had documented his own crimes with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. And worked quickly, taking the most incriminating documents and hiding them beneath her shawl. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady. She returned to the study 5 minutes later, composed and calm. "I should go," she said, standing. "Thank you for seeing me, Father. This has been enlightening." The Viscount nodded, satisfied that he had brought his wayward daughter to heel with the force of his reasoning. He had no idea she had just stolen back her future. As they climbed into their carriage and pulled away from the townhouse, and withdrew the documents from beneath her shawl and handed them to Ferdinand. "Proof," she said simply. Ferdinand examined the papers, and a slow smile spread across his face. "This is enough. More than enough." And leaned back against the seat, feeling the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. She had walked back into her father's house, not as a victim but as a woman reclaiming what was rightfully hers. "Now," she said, "we finish this." And they would. Together. The magistrate arrived at the Valerie townhouse on a grey Tuesday morning, accompanied by 2 constables and Mr. Pemberton, whose expression carried the grim satisfaction of a man about to prove his case beyond any doubt. Anne and Ferdinand waited in the drawing-room across the street, watching from the window as the law descended upon her father's house. Anne had insisted on being present, on bearing witness to this moment, though Ferdinand had argued it might be too difficult. "I need to see it," she had said simply. "I need to know it's finished." Now, as she watched the magistrate's carriage stop before the familiar door, she felt Ferdinand's hand close around hers, warm and steady. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you have already won. You took back your power. Everything else is just formality." The confrontation lasted nearly 2 hours. Through the window, Anne saw figures moving behind curtains, saw the occasional flash of the Viscount's face, red with fury. She imagined him reading the charges, seeing the evidence spread before him, understanding with dawning horror that his daughter, had orchestrated his downfall. When the door finally opened and the constables emerged with the Viscount between them, his hands bound, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not triumph exactly, but release. The man who had controlled her life, who had tried to sell her, who had stolen from her, was finally facing consequences. Her father's eyes scanned the street, and then knew the moment he saw her standing in the window across from him. Recognition and rage and something that might have been betrayal flashed across his face. He opened his mouth as if to shout something, but the constable pulled him toward the waiting carriage, and the moment passed. And watched until the carriage disappeared around the corner, taking her father toward a future he had never imagined for himself. "It's done," she whispered. "It's done," Ferdinand confirmed. He turned her gently away from the window, tilting her face up so he could see her eyes. "Are you all right?" And considered the question honestly. Was she all right? Her father was arrested, her reputation was still questionable, and her inheritance would take months to fully recover through legal channels. But standing here, with Ferdinand's hand warm against her cheek, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: free. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I'm finally myself." They returned to Sedgwick Hall 3 days later, after meeting with solicitors and signing documents that would begin the process of reclaiming Anne's inheritance. Mr. Pemberton estimated she would be one of the wealthiest women in England once everything was settled, her mother's careful investments having grown substantially over the years of her father's mismanagement. "You'll be able to do whatever you wish," Ferdinand said as their carriage climbed the coastal road toward home. "You won't need to depend on anyone, not even me." Anne heard something in his voice, a careful neutrality that didn't quite hide the uncertainty beneath it. She turned to look at him, seeing the man who had offered her a fortress when she needed one, who had stood with her against scandal and judgment, who had held her hand through the darkest confrontation of her life. "Ferdinand," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that now that I have my own money, I might leave?" He didn't meet her eyes. "I'm suggesting that our arrangement was practical. Strategic. You needed protection, and I needed." He paused, struggling with words. "I needed someone to remind me I was still human. But now you don't need my protection anymore. You're financially independent. You could go anywhere, do anything." And felt her heart constrict, understanding what he wasn't saying. He was afraid she had stayed only because she had no other choice. "Pull the carriage over," she said suddenly. Ferdinand looked at her in confusion. "Anne. Pull the carriage over. Now." He rapped on the roof, and the driver obligingly stopped at a wide point in the road overlooking the sea. Anne stepped out before Ferdinand could assist her, and he followed, leaning on his walking sticks, weariness in every line of his body. Anne turned to face him, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the salt air sharp and clean in her lungs. "You're right," she said, and saw him flinch. "Our arrangement was practical. Strategic. We married to save me from Edmund, to save you from isolation. We promised each other respect and loyalty and safety, but not love. Anne. Let me finish." She stepped closer, placing her hands over his where they gripped his walking sticks. "But somewhere between the tea in your study and the confrontation in the church, between facing down blackmail and reclaiming my inheritance, something changed. At least for me." Ferdinand's breath caught. "Changed how?" "I stopped thinking of you as my protector and started thinking of you as my partner. As the person I wanted to share my victories with, the person I wanted beside me in every battle." And felt her voice waver but pushed forward. "I stopped performing the role of your wife and started actually being your wife. And I realized that this marriage, this supposedly practical arrangement, has become the most real thing in my life." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the sea and the cry of gulls overhead. Ferdinand stared at her, and then saw hope warring with disbelief in his expression. "I don't have pretty words," she continued, "and I don't have romantic declarations. But I have this: I choose you, Ferdinand. Not because I need your protection or your name, but because I want to spend my life with someone who sees me as an equal. Someone who fights beside me instead of for me. Someone who makes me laugh and challenges me and reminds me that being broken doesn't mean being defeated." Ferdinand's eyes were bright, and then realized with shock that he was fighting tears. "I thought," he said roughly, "that you would realize you deserved better. Someone whole. Someone who could dance with you without walking sticks, someone who could. Someone who could what? Be perfect?" And laughed, the sound carrying both exasperation and affection. "Ferdinand, I didn't flee my wedding to find perfection. I fled it to find partnership. And I found it with you. He released one walking stick carefully, reaching up to cup her face with his free hand. I love you, he said, the word sounding rusty but genuine. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was the first night you refused to leave my study. Maybe it was watching you wear emerald silk like armor. Or maybe it was the moment you looked at my scars and saw a man instead of a tragedy. And felt tears spill over, but they were good tears, healing tears. I love you too. And I'm not going anywhere. Not to London, not to Cornwall, not to my newly recovered estates. I'm staying right here, at Sedgwick Hall, with my husband, because this is where I want to be. Ferdinand pulled her closer, bridging the space between them, and kissed her. It was not their first kiss, they had shared brief, ceremonial kisses before, but it was the first kiss that carried the weight of truth, of choice, of a future they were building together not out of necessity but out of love. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ferdinand rested his forehead against hers. You're certain? He asked one last time. I've never been more certain of anything, and replied, echoing the words she had spoken when she agreed to marry him. You're stuck with me, Your Grace. For better or worse. Then I suppose, Ferdinand said, a smile breaking across his face like sunrise, I'm the luckiest broken duke in England. And laughed and kissed him again, there on the cliff road with the sea stretching endlessly before them and the future, uncertain but theirs, waiting to be claimed. They had both been told they were broken, damaged beyond repair. But together, they had built something neither could have built alone, a partnership stronger than scandal, a love forged in adversity, a life that was finally, truly, their own. And that was worth more than any inheritance, any title, any approval society might offer. They had each other. They had truth. They had love. And they would face whatever came next the same way they had faced everything else, together, with hearts of steel and unshakable faith in the partnership they had chosen. The carriage carried them home as the sun broke through the clouds, casting gold across the water, and then leaned against Ferdinand's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, feeling the rightness of this choice. She was home. Not the house, but this person beside her, this partnership, this love that had grown in the darkness and now bloomed in the light. She was finally, completely, home. Wow, we made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, the best way to support me is super simple, just hit like and subscribe. It takes 1 second but helps me create more stories for you. Speaking of which, I've got another one ready to go, click the next video on your screen now and let's continue. See you there.